To the UK and Keir Giles, who's a Russia analyst at the international affairs think tank Chatham House. Thanks so much for your time, Keir. Do you think that Prigozhin is 100% dead?
It's looking more like that. There are more and more indications coming out that actually, yes, this was definitely Yevgeny Prigozhin on board, although we haven't had it categorically confirmed. It's still not 100% cast iron certainty. As you heard from your correspondent earlier on, they will be identifying the bodies by DNA samples, which suggests that you won't even be able to identify Dmitry Utkin, that other Wagner leader, by his very distinctive Nazi tattoos, which suggests that the bodies really are quite badly mutilated. So we won't know for some time. But of course, the longer Prigozhin doesn't pop up somewhere else, the more it does indicate that actually he was on board this aircraft.
So many people are thinking it's an assassination.
Yes, they are. Absolutely, because this fits the pattern of Kremlin behavior. And of course, it ties up loose ends for President Putin. For as long as Prigozhin remained unmurdered, he set a dangerous precedent for anybody else in Russia that might be thinking of challenging the Kremlin. Because if you do that and survive, of course, you set an example for other people that might be willing to take up their grievances in the same manner. So the biggest surprise for people over a long period after the mutiny of June, where Wagner marched on Moscow, was that Prigozhin did, in fact, stay alive. Now people are a great deal less surprised.
Forget the prisoners who were given amnesty for fighting with Wagner in Ukraine. Without those, 25,000 is the rough estimate of how many people Prigozhin used to command. What happens to those 25,000? How does the Kremlin especially control those who are operating abroad and quite clearly doing the Kremlin's bidding in an unofficial way?
That's one of the big open questions. And of course, the biggest question for Russia is those elements of Wagner's organization that are still within the country, because these are organized, well-trained, apparently still armed individuals who now have an additional grievance against the Kremlin. So we don't know what measures have been taken against the remainder of Wagner's command structure, because of course, there's more to that than just Prigozhin and Utkin. But you can assume that Russia will see this organization as a threat after it's failed to absorb them into the military, the regular military, after it's failed to exile them to Belarus. And so I think over the next coming days, we can expect to see more measures being taken against those intermediate commanders to make sure that this isn't an organization that can challenge Russia domestically. Abroad, of course, yes, it's a much more fluid situation because Wagner's been this extended arm of the Russian state, pushing forward Russian state power, particularly across Africa, with this band of coups that we've seen across Central Africa recently. There, the lack of this top leadership will have a much more significant impact. And Wagner, for a time, will be directionless.
How do you think, if there were commands coming from the highest echelons of power in Moscow, how they could possibly keep such an operation quiet? If this was indeed a targeted hit, how would the Russian authorities be able to keep it from leaking?
Well, let's not forget that Russia does have long experience in this kind of operation. Sometimes they're uncovered, very often they are not. And yes, it does take a lot of complicity between different elements in the chain of command and people who are actually implementing the murder. But then it is routine business in Russia. And let's not forget, one of the most striking features of this whole affair is how little surprise the method of murder of Prigozhin and the other 9 people on board this aircraft has caused, whether it's within Russia or around the world. And the fact that this is passing by without anybody really batting an eyelid and saying this is business as normal just illustrates how much Russia has regressed from being a state that it is to normal civilized standards of behavior, because this is apparently business as usual.
Keir, rather than ask about the war in Ukraine, because it's my understanding at least that most of the Wagner troops are not currently engaged on the front lines as they were a few months ago. But just to go back to that point, you brought it back to Wagner troops inside Russia. What about Wagner troops outside of Russia? The Kremlin seriously needs to pick up the phone and speak to some of those leaders in Africa, especially those juntas who have been inviting Wagner in. Surely it needs to coordinate with those, because those fighters now are abroad, outside of Russian jurisdiction, and operating in a part of the world which is really sensitive right now.
Yes, we can assume that there will be some urgent consultations going on between those extended elements of Russian power in the form of the Wagner mercenary company scattered across Africa and beyond. Also, of course, Belarus, next door to Russia, received a substantial contingent of Wagner mercenaries, which it seems the Belarusian authorities weren't completely prepared for and not completely happy about. Their status is also unclear. There are some reports that they're actually being moved back as we speak into Russia itself, but that might be simply transferring the problem from one country to another. And so Belarus, too, is a place we need to watch to see how exactly it's going to deal with its Wagner problem.
Keir Giles, thank you so much for the analysis.
Thank you.